I live in a condo that claims it's dog-friendly, but one morning, I opened my HOA account and saw a $500 fine I'd never been warned about. They said my dog was breaking rules she never broke. No cameras, no evidence. Just one complaint that quietly turned into a financial threat. And when I started asking questions, I realized something worse. Out of 7 dog owners, I was the only one being punished. What happened next exposed favoritism, lies, and an HOA that never expected me to fight back. I live in a condo building that proudly advertises itself as dog-friendly. It's printed on the website, mentioned in the brochures, and repeated by real estate agents as a selling point. In reality, it's dog-friendly. In the same way a glass door is friendly to a bird looks welcoming until you actually try to use it. There are over 100 residents in this building. Out of all of us, only 7 people own dogs. 7. That detail matters later. My dog is older now, sweet, calm, fully potty-trained, and struggling with stairs. Her legs just can't handle them anymore. So I do what any responsible owner would do. I take the elevator, walk through the lobby, and exit through the front door to take her outside. No drama, no mess, just routine. One rule exists in our HOA guidelines. Dogs' feet are not allowed to touch the ground in common areas. That means you carry them through the lobby and hallways. Ridiculous? Maybe, but I followed it anyway. Every time. Elevator to lobby, lobby to door, door to outside. Then one morning, I opened my HOA account and saw a balance that made my stomach drop. $500. No letter, no warning, no email. Just a charge labeled accrued violations. According to the notice, I had repeatedly violated the rule by allowing my dog to walk in common areas. Apparently, these instances had been adding up quietly until they decided to dump the total on me all at once. I was stunned not just by the amount, but by the silence before it. HOA rules usually involve warnings, notices, something. But I got nothing. Just a number and an expectation to pay. I immediately started asking questions. When did this happen? How many times? Where was the proof? The answers were vague, too vague. And that's when I realized something worse was happening. Because I wasn't the only dog owner here. I was just the only one being punished. Once the initial shock of the $500 fine faded, confusion took over. I kept asking myself the same question. How could this be happening if the rule applied to everyone? Logic told me that if I was violating HOA rules, then surely other dog owners were too. So I decided to find out. There are only 7 dog owners in our entire condo building, of over 100 residents. That alone should have made enforcement simple and transparent. Instead, it revealed something much uglier. I started talking to the other owners one by one. Quiet conversations in the hallway, short talks near the mailboxes, casual questions framed carefully, because no one wants to be on the HOA's radar. The pattern was immediate and disturbing. 2 of the dogs in this building are far over the weight limit allowed under our HOA rules. It's obvious. Everyone sees them every day. They ride the elevator. They walk through the lobby. Their feet touch the ground. And yet, their owners had never received a warning, let alone a fine. 2 other owners physically cannot carry their dogs at all. Both rely on walkers just to move around. Carrying even a small dog through the building would be impossible for them. Still, no accommodations were ever discussed with them. No notices, no penalties. Then there was me, the only person who had been fined. The only person whose violations had supposedly been tracked. The only person who never received a warning. I asked each owner the same questions. Have you ever been notified? Have you ever been fined? Has anyone complained about your dog? Every answer was the same. No. What made it worse was the irony. I am the only dog owner who consistently cleans up after my dog in the yard. I bring bags. I double check. I don't leave a trace. Lately, walking out there has become miserable because other people's dogs have turned the area into a mess. Stepping outside now feels like navigating a minefield of negligence. And yet somehow, my dog, the quiet, fully potty-trained one, was being accused of soiling the building. That's when I finally heard the real accusation. The HOA president's wife had told the property manager that my dog was Going to the bathroom in the common areas. No evidence. No photos. No cameras. No witnesses. Just a statement. And it was accepted without question. At that moment, everything clicked. This wasn't enforcement. This was selective punishment. A rule used as a weapon, and for reasons that had nothing to do with my dog. Being accused of something you didn't do is frustrating. Being financially punished for it with no warning and no proof is terrifying. The moment I learned the accusation came from the HOA president's wife, I contacted the property manager directly. I asked for specifics, dates, times, locations, evidence, anything that justified a $500 fine quietly added to my account. There was none. No camera footage in the lobby. No photos of my dog. No incident reports. No written complaints from residents. Just a claim that had been repeated enough times to be treated as fact. I explained, calmly and clearly, that my dog is fully potty-trained and has never gone to the bathroom in common areas. I described our routine in detail: elevator straight down, straight through the lobby, and directly outside. No wandering. No stops. No opportunity. Then I did something else. I brought receipts, not paper ones, but people. The other dog owners were more than willing to speak up. They confirmed they had seen me carry my dog. They confirmed my dog always goes outside. They also confirmed something even more damaging to the HOA's position. They had never been fined, warned, or even spoken to about violations. That's when the conversation shifted from accusation to damage control. During that call, the property manager revealed something shocking: the fine had never been formally brought before the HOA board. It was added without a hearing, without my input, and without a vote. Even worse, she admitted the HOA had discussed escalating the issue to court or placing a lien on my property if I didn't pay. A lien over an unproven accusation. At that point, I stopped defending myself emotionally and started speaking legally. I pointed out the lack of evidence, the absence of cameras, the selective enforcement, the fact that no accommodations existed in the CC&Rs for disabled dogs or owners, and the reality that enforcing a rule against one resident while ignoring others is a legal liability. A few days later, I received an update. The property manager told me she had spoken to the HOA board and advised them against moving forward without proof, DNA testing, cameras, or consistent enforcement across residents. Taking me to court would be a losing battle. She also acknowledged that accommodations would need to be added to the governing documents before enforcement could even be attempted. The fine hasn't disappeared yet. It's still sitting in my account like a quiet threat. But the tone has changed. The pressure has eased. And for the first time, they're being forced to answer questions instead of hiding behind authority. The next HOA meeting is coming. And this time, I won't be walking in alone. Once the property manager admitted the fine had never gone before the board, something subtle but important changed. The conversation stopped sounding authoritative and started sounding cautious. That's usually the moment when an HOA realizes the person they're dealing with isn't going to quietly comply. I asked a simple question. Can you show me where in the CC&Rs this fine is authorized without notice or a hearing? There was a pause, a long one. The governing documents mention rules. They mention violations. They even mention fines. But nowhere do they allow penalties to be stacked silently without notification. And nowhere do they outline how accusations are verified, especially ones as serious as a dog allegedly relieving itself inside a building. That's when I requested everything in writing. I asked for copies of all alleged incident reports. I asked for the dates my dog supposedly violated the rule. I asked for proof that other residents had been fined equally. And I asked for documentation showing that accommodations for elderly dogs or disabled owners existed at all. The answers trickled in slowly, carefully worded, non-committal. In the meantime, word spread. Other residents began asking questions quietly at first, then more openly. If one person could be fined without notice, anyone could. If enforcement was selective, no one was safe. HOA authority only works when people believe it's fair. The property manager called again a few days later. Her tone was noticeably different. She explained that the board was reconsidering its position. and that pursuing legal action or a lien would likely expose the HOA to unnecessary risk. Translation: they had realized this wasn't worth it. She also admitted something else: if they were forced to enforce the rule consistently, they would have to address the overweight dogs, the owners who physically couldn't comply, and the complete lack of accommodations in the governing documents. That alone would create conflict they weren't prepared for. For the first time, the power balance shifted. This was no longer about my dog. It was about precedent, about whether an HOA could quietly punish someone based on a personal dislike and hope they'd just pay to make it go away. The fine still hadn't been removed from my account. It sat there like a reminder that this wasn't over. But now, they were hesitating, and hesitation from an HOA is often the first sign of retreat. The next board meeting was officially scheduled, and this time, they wouldn't just be discussing rules. They'd be explaining themselves. The HOA meeting was scheduled for the following week, and for the first time since this started, I felt something close to control. Not confidence, just clarity. I knew the facts. I knew the rules. And more importantly, I knew where they had crossed the line. When I walked into the meeting room, the atmosphere was tight. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The HOA president sat at the front, rigid and unreadable. His wife wasn't officially on the board, but she was there, sitting close enough to be seen, quiet enough to avoid accountability. The property manager began with routine items: budgets, maintenance, landscaping. It felt almost insulting how normal everything sounded, considering someone in the room had been threatened with court over a lie. Then my item came up: the fine. I was invited to speak, and I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I laid out facts slowly, carefully. I explained my dog's condition. I described my daily routine. I stated clearly that my dog has never gone to the bathroom in common areas. Then I asked the questions they had been avoiding. Where is the evidence? Why was I never notified? Why was I fined when other dog owners were not? Why was the fine never voted on by the board? No one answered immediately. The property manager attempted to explain ongoing concerns, but when pressed, admitted there were no photos, no cameras, and no written complaints from residents, only a report that had been passed along verbally. That was the moment the room shifted. Other residents spoke up, one by one, calmly, confirming they had seen me carry my dog, confirming they had never seen my dog make a mess, confirming they themselves had never been fined despite similar situations. Selective enforcement was no longer a theory. It was public. The HOA president finally spoke, but carefully. He framed it as a misunderstanding and suggested the board would review procedures going forward. No apology, no acknowledgement of the stress caused, just distance. But distance didn't undo what had already happened. The meeting ended without a final decision. The fine remained for now, but the narrative had changed. This wasn't about a rule anymore. It was about credibility, and the board knew it. As I left the room, I realized something important. They weren't angry. They weren't defensive. They were nervous. The days following the HOA meeting were unnervingly quiet. No emails, no letters, no follow-up notices. The $500 fine still sat in my account, unchanged, like a placeholder they hadn't decided what to do with yet. Silence, in situations like this, isn't peace, it's strategy. Neighbors started stopping me in the hallway. Not loudly, not publicly, just enough to say, "I'm glad you spoke up," or, "That wasn't right." A few admitted they'd always been afraid of pushing back. HOAs thrive on that fear, the assumption that compliance is easier than confrontation. Then the property manager called again. Her voice sounded tired. She explained that the board had gone back and forth after the meeting. Some members wanted to quietly remove the fine and move on. Others were worried about setting a precedent because admitting they were wrong meant acknowledging selective enforcement. She also admitted something else. Enforcing the rule consistently would require major changes. Cameras in common areas, formal reporting procedures, equal fines for every violation, and possibly accommodations written into the CC&Rs for elderly dogs and disabled residents. None of that was simple. None of it was cheap. And none of it was worth it for one dog. I was told the board was leaning toward resolution, but no timeline was given. No guarantees. just hesitation layered on top of bureaucracy. Still, the tone was clear. This was no longer about punishing me. It was about minimizing damage. Meanwhile, the yard situation got worse. Dog waste continued to pile up, visible proof of how selectively rules had been applied. Ironically, the very issue they accused me of was being ignored where it actually existed. A week later, another update arrived. The property manager said the board had been advised by legal counsel to avoid further action unless they could provide evidence, enforce rules uniformly, and amend governing documents properly. In other words, stop. The fine was still there, but the threat was gone. What lingered instead was something far more dangerous to an HOA than a lawsuit scrutiny. Residents were paying attention now, asking questions, reading documents, watching who got enforced and who didn't. And once people stop being afraid, control becomes much harder to maintain. This wasn't over yet, but it was unraveling. Something subtle but unmistakable had changed in the building. The rules hadn't been rewritten yet. The fine hadn't officially disappeared. But the way people behaved, especially the HOA, was different. They were watching themselves. I noticed it first in the small things. Emails from the HOA suddenly sounded more formal, less threatening, more careful with wording. Notices that used to feel like commands were now framed as reminders. Authority had shifted from assumed power to cautious procedure. That doesn't happen unless someone higher up has told them to slow down. Neighbors began sharing stories quietly, the kind of conversations that only happen once people realize they're not alone. Stories about fines issued without explanation, complaints that went nowhere, situations where certain residents were watched more closely than others. One name came up repeatedly: the HOA president's wife. She wasn't officially on the board. She didn't vote. She didn't sign documents. But everyone knew her influence carried weight. Complaints she raised moved faster. Issues she disliked became priorities. People she didn't get along with suddenly found themselves on the radar, including me. I learned that the accusation against my dog hadn't come from a written report or a maintenance issue. It started as a casual comment. Then it was repeated. Then it became a concern. And eventually, it turned into a fine without anyone stopping to ask whether it was true. That's how power abuses happen. Not loudly, quietly, incrementally, hidden behind policy language and past. Along until no one remembers who started it. The HOA president avoided eye contact whenever he saw me. His wife stopped attending meetings entirely. Distance, once again, became the strategy. If they couldn't win, they could at least disappear. But disappearance doesn't erase impact. The property manager, caught in the middle, was now under scrutiny too. Residents had started emailing her directly, asking for clarification, requesting documents, wanting explanations in writing. The same system that had worked against me was now being used by others. And that made one thing very clear. This was never just about my dog. It was about control without accountability. The fine still existed on paper, but in reality, it was collapsing under its own weight. And everyone involved knew it was only a matter of time before it officially vanished or took someone's position with it. Because when authority realizes it's being watched, it either reforms or it removes the people who caused the problem in the first place. About 2 weeks after the meeting, something finally changed, but not in the way I expected. There was no announcement, no apology, no message acknowledging that a mistake had been made. Instead, the HOA chose the path it knows best: silence and quiet correction. I logged into my HOA account one morning out of habit. The $500 fine was still there. Same balance, same description. Nothing obvious had shifted. But later that afternoon, an email arrived from the property management office, not addressed specifically to me, but sent to all residents. It was carefully worded, almost sterile. It explained that the HOA was reviewing enforcement procedures related to pets in common areas and that no further actions would be taken until the review was complete. No mention of fines, no mention of complaints, no mention of accusations. But the timing wasn't a coincidence. Later that day, the property manager called. She didn't sound defensive anymore. She sounded resigned. She explained that the board had decided not to pursue my fine further, but they weren't ready to formally remove it yet. Instead, it would be placed on hold pending policy updates. A freeze, not justice but retreat. Then came the real revelation. She admitted that internal discussions had turned ugly. Board members had started asking who authorized the fine, why it wasn't brought to a vote, why no documentation existed, and why only one resident had been targeted when others were clearly violating the same rules. The answers weren't good. Responsibility bounced from person to person until it landed where it always had, on the property manager. She was being blamed for procedural errors, despite acting on information given to her by the HOA president's wife. She didn't say that last part out loud. She didn't have to. I was told quietly that her position was under review, not because of me alone, but because my case had exposed larger problems: inconsistent enforcement, poor documentation, personal influence overriding process. In other words, cracks. Days later, the fine amount in my account changed. Not removed, adjusted, zeroed out, but still listed. A ghost entry. Something they could claim was resolved without admitting fault. And just like that, the pressure was gone. No more calls, no more warnings, no more threats of court or liens. But the damage had already spread. Residents were watching now, asking questions, keeping screenshots, reading bylaws. The HOA hadn't just lost control over one situation, they'd lost the benefit of blind trust. And HOAs depend on that more than anything. The fine was effectively dead. The silence confirmed it. What remained was the fallout, and the quiet understanding that this would never happen the same way again. It didn't happen all at once. Power never shifts loudly, it leaks. The first sign was an email from the HOA titled, "Management Update." Short, vague, carefully neutral. It announced that the community would be transitioning to a new property management representative in the coming weeks. No explanation, no thanks, no farewell. But everyone knew the property manager was done. What struck me wasn't satisfaction, it was clarity. She wasn't removed because of one fine. She was removed because my situation had exposed how fragile the entire system was when examined closely. One resident pushing back had forced the board to look at its own behavior, and they didn't like what they saw. After that email, the building changed again. The HOA president became almost invisible. Meetings were shorter, less commentary, more deflection to committee, review and legal guidance. The confidence that once filled the room was gone, replaced with caution and distance. And his wife? Her influence evaporated overnight. She stopped attending meetings, stopped lingering in common areas, stopped offering unsolicited observations about rules and violations. The complaints that once moved instantly now stalled or disappeared entirely. It became clear that her power had never been official. It had depended on silence and assumption. Once those were gone, so was she. Residents began comparing notes openly now, not whispering, talking, sharing emails, asking why certain rules existed but were never enforced consistently, asking why accommodations were missing, asking why fines were applied selectively. Questions are dangerous to organizations built on compliance. The new management company requested documentation for everything. incident reports, proof, board approvals. Suddenly, nothing moved without a paper trail. The very process that had been ignored when it hurt me was now mandatory. A week later, I logged into my account again. The fine was gone. Not adjusted, not frozen, removed. No explanation, no apology, just erased as if it had never existed. But I remembered, and so did everyone else. This wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. No dramatic confrontation, no admission of wrongdoing, just a quiet acknowledgement that the system had failed and had been forced to correct itself. The HOA still existed, the rules still existed, but the fear didn't. And that was the real outcome. Because once people learn, they can question authority and survive, it becomes much harder to control them the same way again. When the fine disappeared from my account, I didn't feel relief the way I thought I would. There was no rush of victory, no satisfaction in seeing that number gone. What I felt instead was exhaustion, the kind that settles in when you realize how much energy it takes just to defend yourself against something that should never have happened. For weeks, my life had revolved around documentation, conversations, and anxiety. Every notification from the HOA portal made my chest tighten. Every email felt like it might reopen the situation. Even walking my dog had become stressful, not because I was doing anything wrong, but because I knew how easily a lie could be turned into a punishment. That's the part people don't talk about with HOAs. It's not just the rules, it's the psychological pressure. The system is designed to make resistance feel dangerous. Court, liens, legal fees. The threat isn't always real, but it feels real enough to silence people. I realized how many residents had been counting on someone else to speak up because they were too afraid to risk it themselves. I don't blame them anymore. I understand them. Even after everything was resolved, I caught myself hesitating in common areas, watching who was around, being extra careful, not because I needed to be, but because the trust was gone. Once you've seen how quickly authority can turn personal, you don't forget it. What stayed with me most wasn't the fine, it was how easily the lie had traveled. One comment, one assumption, one unchecked complaint. That's all it took to trigger weeks of stress and the threat of losing thousands of dollars. No cameras, no evidence, no due process, just power moving in the wrong direction. The HOA never apologized. They never acknowledged the harm. And in a way, that confirmed what I had already learned. Systems like this rarely admit fault. They simply correct course and hope time will erase memory. But memory matters. I now read every notice. I keep records. I attend meetings. Not because I enjoy it, but because awareness is the only real protection in environments like this. Rules don't protect people. Knowledge does. The fine is gone. The threat is gone. But the lesson stays. And if this could happen to me quietly, unfairly, without proof, it could happen to anyone who assumes it won't. That's the real cost of winning. Once the fine was gone and the property manager was quietly exiting, something subtle began to change in the building. It wasn't dramatic. There were no banners, no announcements. Just a feeling, a shift in the air. Residents started talking to each other more openly. Where before there was whispering and avoidance, now questions were being asked. Small things first. Has anyone else noticed selective enforcement? Did anyone else receive that email? What happened with the fines? The conversations were careful, yes, but growing louder with each week. It became obvious that the HOA's authority was no longer automatic. People were noticing inconsistencies. They were comparing notes. They were keeping screenshots and emails. Proof that authority could not be exercised in secrecy anymore. The very power the HOA had wielded over me silently was now scrutinized by the entire building. Even small violations were suddenly being questioned. If a board member claimed someone broke a rule, residents wanted to see documentation. If a complaint was raised, it was discussed openly. Authority had shifted from unquestioned enforcement to cautious oversight. The fear that once allowed selective fines had begun to dissipate. The president himself began to avoid direct confrontation. His once dominant presence in meetings was now quiet, cautious, measured. Even his wife, whose influence had caused the initial fine, had stopped appearing publicly. Residents no longer deferred automatically to her opinions. Her word alone no longer carried power. It had to be backed by process, evidence, and documentation. For me, it was almost surreal. The building I had feared, where one false accusation had threatened financial and legal consequences, was slowly becoming a community that questioned, verified, and participated. People who had previously stayed silent were now engaged. Neighbors, once passive, were now watching the board and its actions closely. The yard, still messy from careless dog owners, was now a symbol rather than a threat. It reminded everyone how rules had been inconsistently applied and how unchecked authority could impact lives. People began cleaning up, talking to each other, and realizing that responsibility was shared, not something to be left to an invisible enforcement system. By the end of the month, there was a quiet sense of empowerment among residents. Not victory in the dramatic sense, but understanding, awareness, the knowledge that silent abuse of authority could no longer go unnoticed. And that made all the difference. With the community now more alert, I began noticing changes that felt almost like small victories. The board, once so confident in selective enforcement, was now slower, more cautious, and strangely accountable. Emails were longer, clearly worded, and included citations to the CC&Rs. Notices now referenced specific policies rather than vague violations. The tone had shifted from authoritative to procedural, and it made a subtle but profound difference. Residents were more engaged too. Small meetings popped up in the lobby. People discussed bylaws, enforcement, and fairness. They compared notes, asked questions, and even challenged decisions politely but firmly. The collective awareness became a form of protection for everyone. I realized that my fight had unintentionally empowered others. People who might have quietly complied for years were now thinking critically about how authority was applied. As for the HOA, change was slow but inevitable. The board had started discussing the idea of formal accommodations for elderly dogs and owners who physically cannot carry them. Policies were being drafted to clarify the fine process, evidence requirements, and notice procedures. For the first time, it felt like rules were being designed to protect residents, not punish them selectively. My dog, blissfully unaware of the drama, continued her routine. Elevator to lobby, lobby to front door, straight outside. Her simple daily walk had exposed flaws in a system that claimed to be fair and dog-friendly. It was ironic, almost poetic. A small, fully potty-trained dog had triggered a chain reaction that changed the building's governance and the behavior of hundreds of residents. I noticed a shift in my neighbors' behavior too. People who had previously avoided interaction began to smile, greet me in the hallway, or share a quick word about pets or rules. The fear and tension that had lingered for months had dissipated. Awareness replaced anxiety. Community replaced suspicion. I also learned a lesson about accountability. HOAs operate under the assumption that residents won't challenge them. But when someone does, when you document, speak up, and refuse to accept selective enforcement, the system falters. Authority isn't absolute. Rules are only as strong as the people willing to question them. The $500 fine is gone. The property manager is gone. The president's wife no longer influences decisions unofficially. The building, slowly but surely, is changing. And while I don't expect perfection, I've seen firsthand that vigilance, courage, and consistency can reshape even a rigid, hierarchical system. Most importantly, I learned that fairness isn't just about rules. It's about accountability, transparency, and ensuring that the people making decisions can be questioned. And sometimes, all it takes to spark change is one person and one dog refusing to be silenced. Even after the fine was gone and the property manager was replaced, the story didn't vanish. That $500 charge had left a shadow not just on my account, but on the community itself. People remembered how easily authority could be misused. They remembered the uncertainty, the fear, and the quiet whispers about selective enforcement. The lesson wasn't just mine, it belonged to everyone in the building. I started noticing residents talking about accountability more openly. They questioned vague memos. They asked for documentation before accepting claims. Rules that had once been accepted without question were now being dissected. analyzed, and verified. People were awake to the idea that dog-friendly didn't automatically mean fair, and board decisions didn't automatically mean just. It was in these small acts that real change happened. The HOA president, once untouchable, became more reserved. His wife, who had catalyzed my find through personal dislike, disappeared from the board's influence entirely. No one formally announced it. There was no drama. The shift was quiet, almost bureaucratic, but it was real. Authority had been reminded that personal bias has limits. Meanwhile, my neighbors had started looking at me differently, not because I wanted attention, but because standing up, documenting, speaking clearly, attending meetings showed that rules must be enforced consistently. That fairness isn't a suggestion, it's a requirement. People were inspired to advocate for themselves in ways they hadn't considered before. The fine, though gone, served as a permanent lesson. Every time someone brought up rules, responsibilities, or complaints, there was now an unspoken awareness the HOA could no longer act unchecked. Residents were paying attention. Authority had become accountable, at least more than it had been before. For me personally, it reinforced a lesson about vigilance. Even in small communities, even with a tiny dog and simple rules, unchecked authority can escalate quietly. But with documentation, calm persistence, and willingness to speak up, the balance can be restored. And my dog, blissfully unaware of the chaos, she continued her walks, carried gently in my arms through the lobby, as she always had. A small creature had unwittingly catalyzed a significant shift in power, fairness, and transparency in a system that had once seemed untouchable. The building may never be perfect. HOA politics rarely allow perfection. But the fear that had once gripped residents, the silent tension that hung over every hall and yard, had lifted. The shadow of a lie had taught a lasting lesson. Accountability matters, and fairness isn't optional. Months passed since the fine was removed, but the impact lingered. The building felt different now, not in ways immediately visible, but in subtle, important ways. Conversations were more open. Residents no longer assumed that board decisions were absolute. Emails were scrutinized. Notices were read with care, not blind compliance. Awareness had replaced fear. The HOA, now operating under new management, slowly began implementing real procedural improvements. Policies were clarified. Rules were written more clearly. Enforcement protocols were formalized. There were discussions about accommodations for elderly dogs and residents who physically couldn't carry their pets. While not perfect, these steps were concrete evidence that pressure and persistence could drive change. I noticed a shift in how people treated each other too. Neighbors who had stayed silent during my ordeal now spoke more freely. They asked questions during meetings, shared observations, and even reminded each other to follow rules responsibly. The community became participatory instead of passive. It was as if one small challenge had created a ripple effect, encouraging everyone to take ownership of the space they shared. For me, there was a personal takeaway beyond HOA politics. I realized how easy it is for authority to overreach when no one questions it. How rules, no matter how well-intentioned, can be applied unfairly when power is unchecked. And how courage, persistence, and careful documentation are powerful tools against arbitrary enforcement. My dog, once the unwitting center of conflict, had become a symbol of fairness, a reminder that even small residents can spark large change. The experience also taught patience. Change in bureaucracy is slow. Threats can linger long after the immediate danger has passed. Yet consistent observation, rational dialogue, and persistence gradually tilt the balance. And the building, though far from perfect, is a safer, more transparent place because of it. Walking my dog now feels different. There's no tension in the elevator, no worry in the lobby, just routine. But each step reminds me of the months I spent defending myself against an unjust fine, the board's internal politics, and the courage it takes to speak up in a system designed to intimidate. Ultimately, this story isn't just about one dog, one fine, or one building. It's about fairness, accountability, and the quiet power residents have when they refuse to accept selective enforcement. That knowledge now exists in our building, and it's stronger than any fine ever could be. The final chapter of this ordeal wasn't dramatic. There were no court battles, no public apologies, and no headlines. But it was complete in the way that matters most: the system, the community, and I had all learned something lasting. By now, the HOA had officially updated its policies. Enforcement procedures were documented. Notices were required for any alleged violation. Accommodations for disabled pets and owners were being written into the CC&Rs cameras, and DNA testing, once hypothetical, were discussed as options for truly verified incidents. The focus had shifted from arbitrary fines to fairness and transparency. A building that had once operated under fear and selective enforcement was slowly turning into one governed by clarity and consistency. I watched neighbors respond differently to rules. They no longer assumed authority was untouchable. Questions were welcomed. Clarifications were demanded. Residents were finally learning that accountability is not just a tool for enforcement. It's a shield for fairness. Even the dog owners who had ignored rules previously began following them more conscientiously, not because they were scared of fines, but because the culture of oversight had changed. The personal lessons were just as important. I learned how vital documentation is, how persistence and calm advocacy can prevent injustice, how one person armed with knowledge and patience can hold a system accountable, and perhaps most importantly, I learned the value of community awareness. Power thrives in silence, but when people pay attention, it falters. My dog, blissfully unaware of all the chaos she had indirectly inspired, continued her daily routine. Elevator, lobby, front door, and straight outside. Yet through her quiet presence, she had triggered a ripple effect that changed policies, attitudes, and the very way people in the building viewed authority. It's ironic and humbling. One small, well-behaved dog had done what months of resident complaints had never achieved: real, structural change. I realized the story could have ended very differently. The fine could have stayed. The property manager could have remained. Residents could have stayed silent. Fear could have prevailed. But it didn't. Knowledge, persistence, and the courage to question authority prevailed. And that is the lasting impact far beyond $500. Beyond HOA politics, beyond one building. This isn't just my story. It's a reminder. Fairness requires vigilance. And the voice of one person, if strong, patient, and clear, can spark change that affects everyone. Systems that feel untouchable can be held accountable. Lies, favoritism, and selective enforcement can be exposed. And even in small communities, the combination of awareness and courage can restore balance. The building still has its quirks. Rules still exist. Dogs still live here. But the fear is gone. The power is shared. And justice, quiet and patient, has been restored, one carefully carried dog at a time.